The federal government is known to be engaged in a widespread program of spying on ordinary Americans through the National Security Agency. However, the United States government has now additionally made use of private surveillance companies to conduct illegal surveillance by purchasing customers' private information from those corporations. The USA Patriot Act has now been in effect for 12 years since it was signed into law as the Bush administration's response to the September 11th attacks. Since then, surveillance on not only American citizens has increased exponentially during the Obama administration, but on foreign governments as well. One in particular instance, Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff discovered her private communications had been intercepted by the National Security Agency, thanks to revelations made public by Edward Snowden. To talk to us today about the acceleration of the NSA surveillance programs, both at home and abroad, and ways in which you can take practical steps to stand against this breach of your privacy, we're joined by Pritap Chatterjee. He's the executive director of CorpWatch. He also just wrote an article explaining how private corporations are mining data for the U.S. government. He's our guest on the show today. Welcome to the show, Pritap.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what systems is the government using to track Americans?
The U.S. government is using a variety of ways to keep track of Americans. Track quote-unquote terrorists, but also people that might be protesters like Occupy people or animal rights activists or environmental organizers. And the way they do it is they're able to keep track of people's phones, where they go. They're able to listen to their communications, record their communications. They can also hack into your email, and they can follow everything that you type on your computer. And they do this largely with the help of private contractors. They use technology that's available in the marketplace, but they also commission companies to do this work so that it helps them break the laws so they can track people. They have reinterpreted the laws, shall we say.
So let me get this straight. The federal government is actually using private corporations, contracted corporations, government contractors, to spy on the American people.
That's absolutely correct. The way I explain this is you can divide the world of contractors into three. You have data providers, and we know the data providers, they're Apple, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Twitter. Some of them we pay, some of them give us services for free. Then you have the data brokers. These are the people that put ads on your computer screen when you type something to Google. And that helps pay up for some of the free services that you get from Facebook. But then there are the data hackers. And these are people who work in government contract. What does that mean? That means that you and I pay for it. Through our taxes, we're giving money to the government, to the FBI, to the NSA, and they're using that money to hire people to follow what we're doing online.
So our tax dollars are going to spy on ourselves through
Correct.
Government contracted hackers.
That's exactly right.
This is the claim that you're making. Okay, let's substantiate. Let's substantiate the claim. Back this up? Give me some facts.
So the FBI, for example, uses a couple of contractors. One's James Byman in Virginia, and the second is a company called Harris in Florida. And what they do is they
Okay, what was the first contractor?
Sorry, James Byman, B-I-M-E-N.
James Byman, and the Florida contractor is
Harris Corporation.
Harris Corporation.
Now, Harris is a very big company. They sell radios to security services. They run the national criminal databases for the FBI. They have always tracked people, but in ways that you and I normally expect and understand. So if you have a sexual predator, you have somebody dealing in child pornography, if you have somebody who's been smuggling or involved in theft or murder, there's a database. The FBI contracts with companies like Harris to run that database so they can find the people. The contractors don't necessarily always have access to that database, though sometimes they operate them. But now they've asked Harris to do a little more than that. They're asking them to help them to devise software to be able to go into people's computers without their knowledge. And this is where it becomes unconstitutional and it violates the Fourth Amendment. So
now, let me jump in, because there are many times when people will open up their email and there may be some sort of a virus or a worm that infects their computer, and malware of some sort, or it may automatically install when you open up your email. If this company, Harris, is actually designing software for the federal government to help with backdoor spy programs, for domestic backdoor spy programs, how exactly are they implementing these software programs, and how are these programs getting on people's computers with or without their knowledge? Is it through email, malware, or is there some other way? Is it pre-installed on computers? Help our viewers and myself understand what and how these programs are getting into the computers.
Well, there are many different ways the programs can get into computers. The simplest and easiest way, but it's not in any way foolproof, is to attach it as an email. So this is typically done to track people whom the government has a particular interest in. So you have to target an individual. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to implement because, A, you need to know who the person is. Then you have to get a warrant. And then you have to make sure that you send them an email that they're going to open. And of course, if they change their email accounts, after all that investment, you got to start over again. So let's say the government wants to follow John Smith because John Smith is involved in smuggling body parts, shall we say. So then what happens is when they have their email address, they would turn to James Byman or Harris and say, we want you to devise some kind of email attachment or website, which if this individual clicks onto, will allow us to install software on their computer so we can track them. And once that software gets into your computer, it can turn the microphone on, it can turn the camera on, it can log every keystroke. So when you type, it'll take a picture of your screen, many times a second and a minute, and it will and an analyst sitting at the other end at the FBI or something will be able to reconstruct everything you do in front of your computer or in front of your phone. So, but as I mentioned, this is when you want to track a specific individual.
And this is all being done without warrants?
Now, it varies. We understand that in many cases the agencies don't always ask for warrants. So.
Well, okay, if they're not asking for warrants, are they using the Patriot Act, national security letters?
Exactly.
The threat of terrorism, national security? What's the main reason that they're using these techniques to spy on everyday American people?
Well, oftentimes it's the threat of terrorism. So, for example, if you're trying to track, let's say, a thief, it's pretty easy to go to a judge, get a warrant, and just as you might go knock on their door or storm their house and search it, you can get a warrant to spy on their computer. Easy to do. When it comes to terrorism, typically the FBI and the NSA are reluctant to go through normal courts. They go through something called the FISA court. It's a special court that was set up, and it allows them to circumvent the normal system of warrants where you need a judge. They go to a special court. The requests are never turned down. They say, we think this person is a terrorist. Now, that includes a lot of Americans. This has often been done, particularly in Muslim Americans, where they say, well, this person is a Muslim, attends this particular mosque, we need to follow them. And therefore, we want you to give us the authority to be able to install some virus software on their computer and track what they're doing.
Now, how did you personally become privy to this information?
Well, I actually got most of this information. This particular program, I got this information from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, who actually researched these two companies, James Byman and Harris, and they gave me that information, which I then published on CorpWatch's website. Now, that's just when you want to track an individual, but you actually, in your question, asked a very relevant question. Is this something that comes pre-installed? Well, in fact, that is very key to understanding this. When we use software, whether we use, let's say if you use something called Lotus Notes. Lotus Notes is an email program. It's kind of outdated, but a lot of people use it. Well, the government, the federal government, people like the NSA went to these companies and said, can we install a backdoor in it? And that means that if you install Lotus Notes and you use Lotus Notes, the government is able to turn on their little program and be able to follow you and follow what you do without even going to the company because they have a backdoor into the system.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Are you using Lotus Notes as simply an example, or is Lotus Notes actually infected with the backdoor system for the federal government to spy on email users?
It's my understanding that Lotus Notes was built with that a long time ago. And there are a lot of other programs like that. So Lotus Notes is one of the, because it's an older program, has been it's my understanding from the likes of the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and of course the information provided to us by Edward Snowden, is the federal government is constantly, particularly the NSA, looking at ways to either exploit software vulnerabilities without the companies knowing, or ask them for their permission to install a backdoor.
Well, how long has this been public knowledge? I mean, obviously, the ACLU came out. Years. The ACLU came out. They produced the investigation. You have written the article, but how long has the public known about Lotus Notes being infected and other programs of the similar type?
Well, the information has actually been out there for a long time, but most people dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. There have been actually a number of people from the NSA that have spoken about this, and here I'm talking about Ed Loomis, Bill Binney, William Binney, Russ Tice, and there's another individual whose name I forget, who have been blowing the whistle on this for the last 3 or 4 years, and the government has prosecuted them. They have raided their houses. These are people who worked for the NSA and blew the whistle. They sent the FBI after them. They went into their houses, took their computers, and tried to shut them down. Some newspapers reported on this, and this is going back over 4 or 5 years, and some even longer than that. But the media didn't pay much attention. And one of the reasons is because they thought these people were kooks. Now that Edward Snowden has produced documentary evidence, actual PDFs, actual paper documents of these programs, and the federal government has admitted it, people are starting to believe it. But that information has been out there for a long time. Hackers, there's a thriving marketplace in this business. So one of the things that the government uses is something what's called a zero-day exploit. So when a new piece of software is downloaded to your computer, let's say you're using a new operating system of Apple or Microsoft, there are generally little flaws in it, and these are called zero-day vulnerabilities. Now, if
can you repeat that again? It's called a zero what?
Zero-day vulnerability.
Zero-day vulnerability.
And that means in a certain number of days. Actually means that there is a glitch in your software, and
so a zero-day vulnerability is something. It's a vulnerability in a piece of software from the moment it's released.
Exactly.
And then from what I know of software always requires updating and it requires patches.
That's one of the reasons.
Okay, so continue now.
So now what happens is, if you know what the vulnerability is, you can go in and you can write software would take advantage of that vulnerability. So it may inadvertently provide a backdoor. And so if you know with the little virus that you're inserting into somebody's computer, if you know how to exploit that flaw, you can then use it to take control of the whole system. And you can say, turn on the microphone, turn on the camera, take photographs of the screen. You can own that person's computer. That's the term that hackers use. So this has always been known. There's an industry of people who sell these. They sell these exploits back to the software companies.
Prithap, I don't mean to cut you off. We're coming up on a break, and I want to continue the conversation about who's profiting from this surveillance, and more really how this information is used, where it is housed. We have a huge data center coming up that is trying to go online in Utah. So I want to talk about that as well. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. We're talking with Prithap Chatterjee about the data collection by the federal government in your computer, right here on WHDT World News.